Okay, everyone. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Okay, let me try. How about now?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, great. So, hello again, everyone. This is Ali Shamshirpur. I'm a recent graduate at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and I had my PhD in transportation engineering. Welcome to another AMS50 webinar. We are very happy to have you here at this very moment. So a little bit of introduction about the committee at first. We have two committee chairs. We have Dr. John Rene and we have Michael Lawrence. And this webinar is moderated and organized by Dr. Jason Carroll and as well as me. So the committee focuses on the impacts of transportation on the economy, environment, and society. It is concerned with efficient, effective, and equitable transportation systems that promote competitive advantage, economic resiliency, and sustainability for our cities, regions, and societies. The committee provides a cross-cutting forum for practitioners and researchers to understand the interrelationship between transportation, economic development and economy, and land use and the policies and management approaches required to create sustainable growth at national, regional, and local scale. So 2 points before moving forward. First, you can get AICP credit on a self-reporting basis for this webinar. To get more info on how to do that, you can follow up with the AICP to get the credit. The second point is if you're not already a friend of the committee, please become a friend. You can easily do that by logging into your MyTRB at mytrb.org, navigating to committees, and then clicking on become a friend, and then selecting AMS50 and then become a friend. So during this webinar today, we have you can raise your questions in two ways. You can either type them in the Q&A section and a moderator reads through your question. And then we also, you can also raise your hand virtually and we can unmute you so you can speak and talk about and ask your question yourself. So another, a last piece here. The last webinar that we had was focused on park and ride facilities. We have two speakers with us. We had Dr. Michael Duncan from Florida State University, and also Dr. Peng Chen from University of Southern Florida. You can find the previous recordings of these webinars on YouTube. We had the link included in the invitation email that we sent out to everyone. You can also feel free to forward that to your colleagues and friends. Yeah, and without any further ado, let me pass the floor to our first presenter.
Hi, so I will introduce our first presenter, and I'm Jason Kao, and a faculty member at the University of Minnesota. And my research interest is about land use and transportation interaction. And currently, I'm the co-editor-in-chief of Transport Research Part D, Transport and Environment. And so our first speaker is Dr. Hui Kong. And Dr. Hui Kong is assistant professor of urban and regional planning at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, University of Minnesota. Being a broadly trained researcher in urban planning, geography, and transportation, she leverages GIS, spatial big data analysis, and statistical models to advance the efficiency and equity of shared mobility and multimodal urban transportation. And her recent work explores the impacts of emerging transportation technologies, such as ride-hailing, micromobility, ICT, and autonomous vehicle on the traditional transport system. And her work has been published in many leading academic journals, including Nature Sustainability, Transport Research Part A and Part D, and Journal of Transport Geography, Environment Planning B, Cities, Applied Geography, and so on, so forth. And let's welcome Dr. Kong and to present her work on the impacts of transport network companies on urban mobility. And this paper appeared in Nature Sustainability.
Okay, thanks, Ali and Jason. So can you see the full screen of my slides? I'll take a minute. Yeah, thanks. So hello, everyone. So firstly, I want to thank the committee for inviting me to give this talk. And in this talk, I'm going to introduce our recent study published on Nature Sustainability. This paper is co-authored by Professor Mi Diao at Tongji University, Professor Jinhua Zhao at MIT, and myself. And the title is The Impacts of Transportation Network Companies on Urban Mobility. So this image shows the traffic jam during the peak hours in Beijing, but actually this phenomenon could be seen in many cities. And besides congestion, we have other problems in transportation, such as high private car ownership, reduced public transit ridership, air pollution, etc. Therefore, the population growth and urbanization have resulted in the growing demand for travel, and the urban transportation system is now facing the significant challenges. And public transportation and private cars are the two traditional travel modes that we are most familiar with. The public transportation provides the highly shared service, but has the limited coverage and often low quality of service. And private cars provide a more flexible service, but they are widely criticized by their significant negative externalities, such as congestion, pollution, etc. Therefore, to find some new urban mobility solutions can help us to address the challenges faced by both public transit and private cars. And they can also help us to meet the growing travel demand and to achieve the sustainability of cities. And in the past decades, TNC, the transportation network companies, such as Uber, Lyft, Didi, and Grab, they have become a new transportation modes in many cities. And these companies provide the on-demand rider service using the online platforms. So as TNCs become more and more popular, many researchers have estimated their benefits using the mathematical models, and they have found great potentials of TNCs. Therefore, we say that TNCs seem to be a promising way to transform the urban mobility to achieve higher efficiency, flexibility, and sustainability. However, despite the theoretical benefits, TNC's impact is under intense debate. In fact, there are multiple channels that TNC will affect urban mobility. On one hand, TNCs can serve as a flexible supplemental option for transit riders and also offers a similar but cheaper alternative to private cars. Thus, they can help us to reduce the reliance on private vehicles. But on the other hand, TNCs may squeeze out public transit and provide easier access to the vehicles, and thus may lead to more congestion. So empirical studies also show the conflict results. Some researchers found that TNCs are able to reduce car ownership, complement public transit, and reduce the traffic congestion. But some other researchers argue that TNCs can increase the car ownership and substitute the public transit and intensify the congestion. So the majority of the empirical studies tend to rely on the interviews and surveys on the TNC drivers and users. And such studies only focus on the specific cities or some limited aspects of urban mobility. And as a result, the findings can be highly dependent on when, where, and how the data are collected. Therefore, a more comprehensive assessment on the overall net effect of TNCs on urban mobility is currently lacking. So the goal of our research here is to systematically examine how the TNCs have changed urban mobility in the United States. And the urban mobility we examined are measured by private car ownership, public transit ridership, and road congestion. And to achieve this, we used a set of panel data at the MSA level to conduct the analysis. And in this study, we only examined the 174 MSAs that have the TNC in operation during our study period, because we only want to focus on the before and after analysis of the impacts of TNC entry. So I will introduce some data we used. So firstly, data on the entry time of TNCs are obtained directly from Uber and Lyft, as shown in this map. And the average household vehicle ownership is calculated based on the American Community Survey. And next, public transit ridership data, it comes from the National Transit Database. So this database contains the monthly ridership for all agencies who receive funds from FTA. And the congestion data we use include two measures for traffic congestion. The first measure is the TTI, Travel Time Index. It is the ratio of the peak period travel time to the free flow travel time. So this measure indicates the intensity of the congestion. And another measure is CH, congested hours. It is calculated by the average number of hours that the road are congestion. So this measure indicates the duration of the congestion. And finally, we also include a set of control variables such as GDP, population, household median income, and unemployment rate. And one specific thing to be noted is because we have different data availability, so we have different number of observations for our three urban mobility measures. For example, for the car ownership, we have yearly data for 12 years in the 174 MSAs. And for the public transit ridership data, we also have data for 12 years in the 174 MSAs, but here we have the monthly data. And for the congestion data, we only have the monthly data for 5 years in 44 MSAs. And in terms of the methodology, basically, we calibrate a set of fixed effect panel data model, and we use the TNC entry time into different MSA as an identification. So we have two models here. The first model is a base model to measure the impacts of TNC entry on urban mobility. So the dependent variable is the log of each mobility measured. And the mobility measure includes private car ownership, public transit ridership, and road congestion level. And the independent variable, it is the dummy variable indicating the presence of TNCs. So it takes a value of 1 if there is TNC service and 0 otherwise. And controls are a set of control variables at the MSA level, including GDP, population, household income, and unemployment. And the theta I here is the MSA fixed effect, and tau t is the time fixed effect. And in model 2, so here instead of using the TNC entry dumming, we include a set of dumming variables to capture the TNC effect over time and the impact of the second TNC operator entering the market. So in this model, a set of dumming variables are used to measure the number of years after the entry of the first TNC operator. And another dumming variable is used to measure the presence of the second TNC operator. So now I'll discuss some results. So firstly, about the impacts of TNC on car ownership. We found that on average, the TNC entry has an insignificant impact on vehicle ownership. And to further explore the heterogeneity in the treatment effect of TNCs, we add an interaction term of the TNC dumming with a new dumming variable, which is the top 10 transit MSA. The coefficient of this interaction term is negative and significant. So this indicates that the entry of the first TNC operator into the top 10 transit MSA can reduce the vehicle ownership by 1% relative to the other MSAs. So this finding, to some degree, indicates that TNC could substitute some private car ownership in the transit-friendly areas. And we also look at the impacts of TNC entering years and the second tier TNC operator. And we found that the magnitude of TNC's effect on reducing car ownership increased over time. And it reaches about 1.09% beyond 4 years after TNC entry. But the impact of the second TNC operator is also insignificant. Then we look at the impacts of TNC on public transit ridership. So firstly, we found that on average, the entry of TNC reduced the public ridership by 8.9%. And this result suggests that TNC substitutes public transit rather than complement the transit. And another finding is the magnitude of TNC's effect on public transit increased over time in the first 3 years after TNC entry, and then remained stable at around 16%. And the entry of the second TNC operator also further reduced the transit ridership. And finally, we look at the impacts of TNC on congestion. So firstly, we look at the impacts of TNC entry on TTI, travel time index, and CH congested hours. And we found that on average, TNC has a positive and significant impact on both of these measures. So this indicates that TNC in general increased the level of congestion. And we also found that the coefficient on CH is larger than on TTI. This indicates that TNC affects road congestion, mainly through the extended congestion hours and slightly through increase the intensity. And in the second model, our results also reveals that there is no significant yearly effect of TNC on TTI, but the effect on CH increased over time, and the entry of the second TNC operator also further increased the congested hours. So that's the major results, but we also realized that there is a potential endogeneity in the entry time of TNCs because Uber or Lyft might not randomly choose the MSA to enter, and instead, they might decide whether and when to enter an MSA based on its mobility trends, such as car ownership, transit ridership, and congestion level. So this indicates that in our model, the dependent variable may in return influence our independent variable. So to address this issue, we further conduct the robustness check, apply an IV regression to address this endogeneity. So we estimate a two-stage D-squares, and in the first stage, we estimate a logic model of TNC entry using the distance from each MSA to the nearest TNC hub city as an instrument. So as presented in this map, the green stars and dots are the TNC hub cities. They are either the Uber headquarters or the regional office. And being close to these hubs could bring about some management convenience to the TNCs. And as a result, it will increase the probability of TNCs to enter the corresponding MSAs. But this factor, the distance, does not have direct correlation with the other mobility trends. Therefore, we say that the distance to the nearest TNC hub could serve as a valid IV in our study. And also to further ensure the validity of our IV, we also exclude the 6 MSAs that are the TNC hubs, because Uber's decision on where to place these hubs may also be correlated with the other mobility trends. So in this table, we compare the results from the base model and the IV regression. And as we can see, the main findings still hold after the robustness check, and the direction of the coefficients are still the same. However, the magnitude of the TNC's effect becomes larger in the IV regression. So this indicates that the TNC effects in reducing public transit ridership and increasing the congestion level, they could be more profound if the operators choose to enter the MSA in random order. And we also conduct a second robustness check. So in this robustness check, it is to conduct the analysis on all the MSAs. Because in our base model, our analysis on vehicle ownership and transit ridership are limited to the 174 MSAs with the TNC operation. But what will happen if we include all the MSAs? So we do this test and expand the analysis to also include the non-TNC MSAs. And again, as we can see from the table, the main results still hold after this robustness check. So finally, to conclude this study, our analysis suggests that the TNCs intensify urban transportation challenges in the United States rather than relieving these challenges. And more specifically, we find that on average, the TNCs have an insignificant effect on vehicle ownership, but they slightly reduce the vehicle ownership in the top transit MSAs. And meanwhile, TNCs serve as the net substitute for public transit and lead to a significant decline in transit ridership. And in addition, different from the vision that TNCs can reduce road traffic congestion by promoting the large-scale ride-sharing, they instead increase the congestion. And this effect on congestion mainly comes from the extended duration and slightly from the increased intensity. And all these main findings still hold after the robustness check. So our findings provide useful insights into the role that TNCs played in urban transportation. So although the theoretical research or the mathematical models prove that the potential benefits of on-demand shared mobility could be great, but this study suggests that translating these potential benefits into the actual gains is much more complicated in the real world. And also, the complex nature of individuals' mobility decisions can further contribute to its complication. And also, the global COVID-19 pandemic and the relevant social distancing policies have also raised the broader questions about shared mobility. For example, the poor ride-sharing service were the first to be shut down. Therefore, although the idea of sharing is still a very promising solution to many urban challenges, we need to find the ideal shared mobility format to achieve the sustainable urban transportation. And this will be even challenging in the post-pandemic world. And finally, some limitations of this study. So firstly, our analysis were conducted at the aggregate MSA level, and we assessed the overall net effect of the TNCs. So if more detailed data are available, then the further studies could be conducted to investigate the behavior mechanisms of the TNC's effect. And the second limitation is the TNCs have become even more popular in the recent years, but our data set only covers the dynamics till 2016. Therefore, the long-term effect of TNCs is not fully captured by our analysis. And lastly, to capture the temporal change in TNC's effect, in this study, we used the number of years after TNC's entry, but a more direct measure should be the penetration rate of TNCs in each spatial unit. And this data is not available in our study, but if the future study can find such data, then it will greatly strengthen the analysis. So this is all I want to share today. Thanks very much for your attention.
And thank you, Hui. And this is a great presentation. And actually, if you see the chat box, there are 2 questions. So we are just going to maybe answer these questions at the beginning. And then if we have extra time, we can raise more questions later. And I'm reading, while you are reading the question, I'll read the questions to all the audience. So the how law and the car ownership and transit ridership may have some general trends over the years. For example, we know transit ridership is decreasing in most US cities. How does this study control such general trends on car ownership and transit ridership?
Yeah, so in our study, thanks for the question. This is a very good question. So in our study, we use the fixed effect panel data. So in this model, firstly, we use the panel data to do this before and after analysis. And also in the model, we have a time fixed effect, which can address some of the noise or errors in the temporal trend of all these factors. So in this way, such like the general trend of the car ownership and transit ridership could be addressed in this model.
Maybe I will just add a little bit because later on you did a robust check, including all MSAs without TNC. I think this can be as a control for your model to control for all of the third-party variables influence. So this just, in addition to your explanation. And then we have a second question. How transit-friendly MSA were defined in this study?
Yes, thanks for the question. So in this study, it is calculated by, because we have the public transit ridership data, monthly data. So we calculate the ridership per capita in each MSA, and then we pick the top 10 MSA with the highest public transit ridership per capita. So we define them as the transit-friendly MSAs. It means these MSAs have the highest transit ridership.
Okay, thank you very much, and Hui. And now I'm going to transfer the floor to Ali and Dr. Carroll.
Hello again. Dr. Páraic Carroll is an assistant professor in the School of Civil Engineering at University College Dublin, where his teaching and research focus is transportation engineering. Dr. Carroll joined UCD in 2019, prior to which he worked as a transport modeler in the Transport Planning and Capital Investment Division of the National Transport Authority, NTA. During this time, he advised government departments on the appraisal and assessment of national transport strategies and policies, including public transport and active mode schemes. Dr. Carroll has also provided guidance to the Irish Climate Change Advisory Council on transitioning to low carbon and sustainable mobility in Ireland. His research expertise lies in the modeling of travel behavior, multimodal transport networks, and systems, with a keen interest in modeling potential solutions and pathways for decarbonization and electrification of transport and mobility. So without any further ado, let me pass the mic to Dr. Carroll. Dr. Carroll, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ali, and thank you, Professor Cow, for the invitation, and also the committee. So this presentation will cover the methodology, the results, and just some brief introduction to this topic of micromobility and public transport integration. This was a paper that was published in Transport Research Part D last year. I've provided details of this paper in the final slide. I'm also joined with Julia Osher, who is one of my PhD students at UCD. She's also a master's graduate from Aalborg University in Denmark and University of Zurich in Switzerland. So she said this is the work of her PhD, but I'll just provide a brief introduction before handing over to Julia. So to provide an introduction to this topic, I suppose into the introduction, the popularity of personal transport modes such as micromobility, electric scooters, electric bicycles, we feel could potentially accelerate this transition to sustainable mobility as they become more commonplace, and more importantly, how they are regulated and how they can be used safely in urban areas. So the integration of these modes and vehicles into the public transport systems, we feel, could be the main way in which these modes could actually encourage a modal shift away from private cars instead of a shift from active modes or public transport. In order to assess the potential for micromobility and how this can hold, how this may hold clues and solutions to this, we feel that there's a way in which micromobility can enhance the accessibility for first and last mile trips primarily, so access and egress trips to and from public transportation nodes. So when we're talking about micromobility, we're of course talking about the use of micro vehicles. So those can be private or shared, and they're usually motorized or human powered, and can be from one wheel up to four wheels. And some examples of those are in this image here, such as electric trikes, electric bikes, skateboards, and more commonly, electric scooters. So what all these modes have in common, I suppose, would be that they're usually low mass, so 350 kilograms or lower. The top speed is usually up to 28 miles per hour or 45 kilometers per hour, and they have low kinetic energy. But what is the real potential of these modes, and what kind of solutions can they provide to urban areas particularly? So firstly, they can be also be used for encouraging a just and equitable redistribution of urban space and safer streets in a way that road space is shared more equitably, firstly. And if there is a modal shift that occurs from private cars, of course, it can lead to a reduction in emissions. But in terms of how we encourage this modal shift is supposed to focus of this presentation in order to make it easier and more convenient to access public transport services. For example, for those who are living in beyond walking distance to the nearest public transport stop or station, we feel that there's a real opportunity for micromobility to enhance this accessibility and to also make it more convenient to carry out a multimodal trip. So the integration of micromobility and public transport, if treated as this hybrid transport mode and as a single trip chain, could be considered as a sustainable transport mode in which the advantages would be for these two modes to complement each other. So micromobility can offer this flexibility and convenience in terms of door-to-door accessibility that isn't often found in some of the best public transport networks. In some areas, there are going to be hotspots for poor accessibility, or for those who have mobility issues or who aren't necessarily interested in walking too far to access the public transport stop. That can obviously lead to a higher likelihood of those wanting to opt for private cars, for example. It can also enhance the spatial reach of existing public transport networks. So the resulting synergy of high-speed public transport, high capacity, high frequency with the door-to-door accessibility provided through the means of micromobility, this will create this degree of access, speed and comfort that competes more competitively with private motorized cars or vehicles. And therefore, the combination makes modal shifts more likely and has a significant potential to contribute to more livable cities, less congestion, and reduced levels of air and noise pollution. So essentially, micromobility would reduce the access barrier in transport deserts in which there is poor accessibility currently. And finally, just before I hand over to Julia, in order to unlock the full potential that micromobility holds, it's crucial to analyze this in the context of this first and last mile trip. So that is the focus of this paper that we conducted, and looking at what is the existing level of research and also knowledge base in this area, and what needs to be done to further understand this first and last mile phenomenon. So I'll hand over to Julia now.
Yes, thank you very much, Páraic. Just 1 second. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so I will tell you a bit more about the analysis we conducted in this paper. So the systematic literature review. And the aim of this analysis was to determine the state of knowledge to date on this particular topic of integration of micromobility and public transport. And we also wanted to identify the gaps in the literature in order to inform further research. And the methodology we used for this systematic literature review was based on this circular published by the TRB, which is specifically concerned about literature search and literature reviews for transportation research. And as Páraic said, and as I mentioned, what we were interested in was specifically research, so papers, articles that were focusing on this integration of micromobility and public transport. So we identified and selected 48 papers from cities all over the world. And what we were interested in finding out was, first of all, how this topic has been studied. So how have these studies approached this topic? Then which factors have been considered in these analyses? So what aspects of this integration have been included? Then we wanted to analyze what effects and impacts these studies have identified. We wanted to understand the impacts and effects that have been studied of this integration. And also the aim, as I said before, of this literature review was to identify the gaps in the literature. So we wanted to understand what is still there for us to study, to research. And this table was just included to show you how complex the integration of these two modes is. And just to give you an idea, there are so many different combinations and different ways of different micromobility services and different ways in which these can be combined with public transport. So depending on if the micro vehicle is private or shared, if it's station-based or dockless, if the micro vehicle can be taken onto the public transport service, etc. So there are so many things that have to be considered and so many different ways of integrating these two modes. And therefore, first of all, we try to kind of identify some main aspects of this very complex system. And what we did was, first of all, identify the data sources. So we wanted to understand these studies that we reviewed, what kind of data were they using and what kind of data sources have they used. Then we wanted to understand what system characteristics they were considering, and I will tell you a bit more about this shortly. Then also what aspects and characteristics of the users they were including in their analysis. And also, as I mentioned, the effects and impacts that this integration has. So first of all, the data sources. We identified possible data sources, and we wanted to understand and review what these papers that we identified on this specific topic, what kind of data sources they were using. And what we found was that most of these studies were based on stated preference and mobility surveys, and a lot of analysis of Chinese cities were using big data volumes from smart card data. So they have these integrated ticketing systems where you can basically rent shared micromobility vehicles and ride the metro on the same card. And so this provides very valuable data, because this is something we found is very difficult to understand this integration and to get data that is actually usable, because you need to, as I said, it's a very complex system. So the data required is quite difficult to get. And we have seen that in the most recent studies with this smart data and new types of vehicles and technologies, this data has increasingly become available to also be able to analyze big data volumes and so on. And then, as I mentioned, we looked at the system characteristics, and what we mean by this is characteristics of the built environment, but also the infrastructure for micromobility. So for example, parking stations, or if it's dockless, some specific areas reserved for these vehicles. Then also the charging infrastructure, if the vehicles are electric, and so on. Then the services and facilities that are available at public transport stations. So for example, Also here, if it's a shared system, we need stations or designated areas, but also, for example, if the micro vehicle can be taken onto the public transport service, there are certain facilities and services that are required. Also, we included in the analysis road infrastructure and safety. So if this is available and what type of infrastructure is available, but also how the traffic, the road traffic in general, for example, speed limits or traffic calming measures. We also included in the analysis policies and regulations and costs, both for implementing measures, but also for the users. But we realized that most studies focused on the availability of infrastructure, both for micromobility, mainly for shared bicycle services, and also on road infrastructure and safety. And what most studies found was actually that this is basically, one of the most important things we saw in this analysis, that the availability of safe, convenient, and protected infrastructure for micromobility around the public transport stations is one of the most relevant factors. So if the infrastructure is there, is available, is safe and convenient, users will take micromobility to the public transport station. And the other aspect we looked at of this system is the user characteristics that were considered in the analysis. So whether they consider socio-demographic attributes, user preferences, the reasons for modal choice, mobility patterns, and also the perception and acceptance of these new micro vehicles, but also of the integration of micro vehicles with public transport. So what we found is that most studies included socio-demographic attributes, and for example, in the studies using GPS data or GIS analysis, mobility patterns were often analyzed. And the last thing we looked for in these studies were the impacts and effects. So we made a list of possible impacts and effects that we were expecting to find or thought were relevant. But what we found in the literature review was basically that almost none of these studies were quantifying any impacts. So some studies looked at the modal shifts that could be expected from the integration of micromobility and public transport and tried to quantify that. And a few other studies looked at social impact. So they looked at how the introduction of micromobility services in connection with public transport, how that could improve equity among different user groups, and also in areas with low public transport accessibility. But yeah, that was one of our main findings, that these impacts and effects have not been really studied and quantified yet. But Páraic will now tell you a bit more about the main findings.
Thank you very much.
So,
okay. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, just two more slides left, Ali. So yeah, just to summarize the main findings. So as Julia has mentioned there, the main gaps we found in the literature were that the impacts, the environmental, social, and economic impacts of the integrated transport system need to be further analysed. There are some papers that have examined this, but there's still a lot left to understand about this. Particularly with the use of electric scooters and electric bikes, there's a lot of work being done already on shared bicycles, but not necessarily the shared scooter model, and also the flexibility that's provided in terms of how you can bring that onto the service if they're foldable. The availability of safe, protected, and continuous infrastructure was, of course, one of the main drivers of micromobility use, and that further data collection research is required to fully understand this. I should say that since this paper has been published, there has since been more studies on this topic, but as this was published in December last year, at that stage, it was still very novel in terms of the research catching up with the new trend in micromobility. So the research obviously is going in the right direction, but in terms of the global pandemic and how that's forced cities worldwide to rethink and reimagine how their strategies to promote and enable sustainable transport in urban areas, micromobility, of course, is part of this solution. I think more measures should be examined in terms of how they can be incorporated for particularly the first and last mile. There's been a lot of issues in certain cities, I know in Europe, where the dockless model has been actually removed from cities because of the safety issues associated with that. In Ireland, for example, where the government is currently considering and due to release legislation in the next few weeks to enable the use of electric scooters and electric micromobility modes in Ireland. Currently, it's illegal to use such devices, but we are already seeing people using them anyway. So there is a demand there, a latent demand that needs to be regulated, and how that demand can be accommodated into the regulatory framework, I suppose, is the challenge. So finally, just overall, this review has kind of highlighted the importance of the infrastructure provision, what's really needed, what's of importance, what is of interest to users, to the micromobility providers, and also what challenges exist in terms of how both providers, those micromobility providers and the public transport providers, can come together to provide this solution that can ultimately be of benefit to both operators and the users as well. So yeah, and what kind of measures need to be adapted to improve and also provide more road space to cater for this first and last mile trip. And finally, just this is the title of the full paper in TRD. So obviously a lot more information can be gathered from that paper. We've just provided a very brief overview of some of the findings. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Julia and Dr. Páraic, for your great presentation and your research. So floor is open for the questions from the audience. I can see a question in the chat room from Ilham. She says, I was wondering if the scope of your study covered Dublin, or was it other cities as well? What specific aspects of infrastructure provision do you think is vital for micromobility integration?
I'll just take the first part of that question and I'll leave the second part to Julia. So the study was, it was international. It was looking at the current state of knowledge internationally. A lot of the papers that we found were from China, based on the micromobility provision there being much more advanced, I suppose, than many cities in Europe, as some cities, particularly in the UK and Ireland, are catching up to this new trend, whereas other cities in Central Europe, in Paris and in parts of Germany and Netherlands, are already having problems with the regulation. But in terms of the specific aspects, I'll leave that to Julia.
Yeah, so I think what we found and what I think is becoming increasingly clear is that the infrastructure needed is one that is very friendly for these new vehicles. So it could be kind of an adaptation of cycling infrastructure, but in these studies we've also seen that it is important that the environment itself is very pedestrian friendly. So we also need low traffic speeds, We need traffic calming measures around public transport services. So we basically need infrastructure that makes users feel safe and that basically make this first and last mile very attractive in order to really promote these mode shifts away from private cars. So I think what we see from this research and what I personally also think is necessary is that the infrastructure becomes basically that the public space is redistributed more fairly so that pedestrians have more space, but also cyclists and micro vehicles have more space, and less space is dedicated to private car use and particularly also parked cars in proximity of public transport stations and also in the catchment areas, because it's not enough to just have this infrastructure around the public transport station. It really needs to be addressed within the catchment area so that these first and last mile trips can be really convenient, and the infrastructure needs to be improved on the whole way.
Just also to add to that as well, in terms of infrastructure provision, we also see that users of micromobility value the extra facilities provided at these micromobility or public transport hubs in terms of the parking facilities, and also if it's a private micromobility user, the storage, if the storage facilities at the transport node. And also not just the physical infrastructure, but also the digital infrastructure in terms of the integration of different operators, applications, mobile applications, and the payment facilities as well. If they can be integrated to make it a seamless process to take one mode onto the other, and if it's paid more looking towards the mobility as a service platforms, or a step towards that direction, I would say.
Great, thank you very much, both. We have another question from Hussein. Hussein, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Carroll and Julia, for the nice presentation. I was wondering, like, did you find any paper or research focusing on changing travel behavior due to this integration? Because it's like a new mobility, people are getting more access to public transit, so there may be like a chance of like changing travel behavior. Thank you.
Yes, so as I mentioned, what most of these studies that we reviewed, and as Páraic said, this is, or at the time when this was published, it was a very novel field of study still. And what we found was that most studies were focusing on how users integrate these two modes, and they were looking at catchment areas and characteristics, but there was very little comparison between the before and after, for example, or the effects and impacts were not really considered in these studies that we found. And this is also something that we realized, that there is a need for research on this, because we don't really understand how the introduction, for example, of micromobility services, how this impacts travel behavior. So there is still a lot to do and to find out on this specific topic.
Thank you. So there is another question from Jeff. I'm reading from the question. Is there a difference in behavior findings between micromobility that is privately owned versus shared systems with respect to how well micromobility supports the transit system? For best public results, should the transit systems run and manage the shared scooters, bike share, etc.?
Just on the second part of that question, I might just address first. So I think, yes, there is a kind of an opportunity and also maybe a responsibility in order for some operators to, use micromobility as a tool, as an extra measure that can be used to enhance patronage on their services, particularly in areas where there is seen as to be a low uptake of their service because of the public transport station or stop maybe in a location that's not so accessible for everyone. So we're seeing in Ireland, for example, one of the main bus operators is considering trialing a shared scooter service in order to link up with its public transport, with its bus service network. As they're seeing that there is an opportunity there to be gained in terms of increasing, because of the increasing stress that the public transport operators are currently experiencing because of COVID, and perhaps this could, of course, lead on in people's consciousness beyond COVID in terms of how people might perceive public transport. Micromobility could be used as an extra mechanism to attract people back to public transport if it's seen as more convenient to do so.
Okay, so thank you very much. And Dr. Kong and Dr. Carroll, I think you have done a great presentation, and I will ask the last question. And actually, from your presentation and also your answers to all those questions have partially answered my question. And as you say, the macro mobility and shared macro mobility and shared mobility are emerging topic in field of transportation. So I think a lot of young scholars, they plan to do the research on this area. And then maybe you can give us some hint. Okay, what do you think the most two important gaps we need to fill in the near term in terms of research?
Okay, well, will I go first? I believe that because it's such a novel mode of transport that I think new sources of data need to be collected first. Because, for example, at the moment we're considering how we can collect data, more in-depth data on how people perceive first and last mile journeys as part of the door-to-door trip and what they value most in that journey. And by getting that data and using that data to perhaps design more tailored, for example, state of preference surveys or other types of surveys to kind of test hypothetically these types of solutions. So I would say the data for first and last mile trips as opposed to the in-vehicle trip would be something that's lacking and needs to be addressed.
Okay, and Julie, Hui, do you have any addition? The most important research gaps we need to address in the next several years?
Yes, I think, as Páraic said, I think mobility will become a lot more tailored to specific user needs, because there are so many ways in which these different modes can be integrated. As I mentioned, there are so many different ways and combinations, and I think it will be very crucial to create this seamless experience for users, so that it is very convenient for them to have access to all these different mobility services, and to also integrate them among each other, so that, for example, with an integrated ticketing system, and also with the availability of information and fair pricing, users can really make informed decisions, and also move around in a very convenient and easy way without needing a private car.
Okay, thank you. Hui?
Yeah, so I'll also add something. So firstly, I totally agree with Páraic and Julia. And so I feel that currently the first thing is we kind of have a gap between the big data and small data. So with the big data, we have some like, for example, we can conduct modeling, analysis, simulation, statistical models. And with the small like survey data, we can inspect into the individual behaviors and the trip chains. However, if we can find a way to combine these two data, which means we can both have a big sample to describe the big pattern, and we can also know the detailed like decision-making process or the behavioral mechanism under this pattern. So this will be very powerful. But currently, there's still some gap between this kind of data, so they are not very well related. So that's the first thing I want to talk about. And the second thing about the micromobility study itself, currently my feeling is that we also have some gap between the theoretical studies and the data-driven studies. For example, data analytics can play very beautiful models to generate very like interesting results from the data. And the theoretical scholars, they have very good discussions about the theories, about the potential or theoretical impacts of such new mobility. However, how can we, like, for example, use empirical data to demonstrate some theories? And how can we use the theories to guide these empirical studies? I feel we still need more, like, better integration between these two parts of the studies. So that's what I feel. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And for all three great speakers, I think, from Hui, your last comments, I'm thinking about this, the mixed method approach. Yeah, and also I think, Dr. Carroll also talked about, the review regarding, the qualitative analysis. So I think, if we have this qualitative and quantitative analysis, that's going to, address many of the questions, in the literature. So I think that's great. And so thank you very much for all three speakers. And let's give one round of virtual applause to the great presentation. And then, so if you are not a friend of the AMS50, and please join us. And then in April, we are going to have another webinar, and the topic is to be determined. Okay, so stay tuned. Okay, thank you. See ya.
Great, thanks very much.
Thanks
Thank
very
you,
much.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.